Thanks for joining everyone to FOCIL breakout
Recording
number
stopped.
2.
Recording in progress.
Yeah, and so from now on, I think the idea is to go with a bi-weekly cadence. Meetings don't have to be like this packed with news, but would be nice to just have like a regular meeting so that people can also like plan for it, know about it, and attend if they want to. We have like planned updates and presentations from like a bunch of you guys. But before, I wanted to just do a small short presentation about some ideas that have been popping up or that I had for the past month. How can I share this? Okay. Can people see it? Okay. Nice. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to flag, I'm gonna go like very briefly because I do want to have time for like discussions around implementation. But yeah, some things I've been like thinking about lately are what FOCIL might become in the future. And one idea was trying to separate roles. So we know PBS, Proposal Builder Separation, but like I was thinking maybe it would be interesting to also think as includers, which are now IA proposers or IL committee members, are just like a very different set of participants that could be rewarded by like an independent reward mechanism. And whether that, I mean, that mechanism is not specified yet, but we do have some efforts towards this. So if any of you has ideas or want to contribute, please reach out, because I think it's just like cool to also think about like what the future of FOCIL might look like. And so in this post, I suggested inclusion fees, or like a new transaction fee that will just go to IL committee members. But it could also be like redirected priority fees. It could be issuance. I think Tony had a comment on the post suggesting this. I asked Twitter, and people were leaning towards transaction fees, but I think it's like nice, and there are like some almost philosophical discussions we can have about like what should be used to reward people that contribute to improve Ethereum's censorship resistance properties. So yeah, if anyone wants to contribute to this effort, I wanted also to flag FOCIL, which is also like thinking about like a very different way of rewarding IL committee members or includers. We also have a grantee from Nethermind Research that's right now working on like kind of trying to define what a transaction like a TFM might look like for FOCIL. So yeah, all are ongoing efforts, but like very interested to get also like contributions from outside or for anyone that wants to contribute. Yeah, I also posted this, which I think is kind of nice to just take a look at, which is like basically the percentage of honest validators, which means like validators that actually like honestly include all transactions they see pending in the public mempool, for all transactions to be included if we had FOCIL with like various sizes of committee. So you see that even with 16, but also like of course it improves as you increase the number of committee members. But yeah, you just need like 15% of the validators contributing to be honest and to include on transactions for all of them to be included within the same slot, which I thought was pretty nice. And this is like made possible by the 1 out of n property. just like the fact that you only need one committee member, to be honest, for the whole mechanism to work properly. So yeah, I just thought it was nice to show this. We also had some IL boost, or like the emergence of a market for ILs. We had discussions on Discord with that was initiated by POTUS, and then we had some thoughts from Terence, from Julian, but also from people that haven't contributed to those discussions before, like people that are like Paul, that is like really kind of deep into pre-confs. And so, yeah, I don't want to get into all of it right now, but it was more to like flag and yeah, also maybe push people to actually go check out these discussions, because it's quite nice, and it's important to discuss this as a broader maybe set of people. And yeah, that was pretty much it on my end. Reach out if you want to work on all this. Let me stop sharing. And now we can probably, so does anyone have thoughts about any of these topics, or does anyone want to say something? Okay, nice. Yeah, reach out if you want to actually contribute on any of these research directions. Maybe the last thing I wanted to flag is like we are actually also starting work on like the privacy or anonymity aspect of ILs and what it might look like in the future with the linkable ring signatures and anonymous broadcast protocols. So if that direction, that research area is also interesting to you, also please reach out. But okay, so the highlight is more on the implementation side of things for today. I know some of you have been working over the holidays on making progress on the FOCIL implementation, and so I wanted to highlight this today. Maybe let's start. So we have a couple of people that have updates. We can probably start with Terence, if that's fine.
Yeah, that's great. One second, let me share my screen. Ba, ba, ba. Share. Okay. Okay, I presume you guys are able to see my screen. Let me know if you cannot see it. Also, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me if you have any questions. So basically, I don't have any slides, unfortunately, but what I have is some just like implementation notes that I have made some opinionated design choice along the way when I was implementing FOSSIL for Prism. Some of those are probably wrong. And I have to admit that my PR, I think it's in a pretty good place to start testing for FOSSIL. But then again, if any serious people that started reviewing my PR will probably find multiple bugs as well. That's another my disclaimer. But I can probably just share my notes in this call. And just for the consensus layer client team that's implementing FOSSIL, we'll probably run into the similar design decision that I run into. But yeah, so let's get started. So I kind of separated them into like block processing, block construction, syncing, validator, API category. So for block processing, you have to make a decision on what you do when you sync a historical block that essentially doesn't have inclusion list, right? Because in the current inclusion list design, it's kind of like Goldfish. You basically only remember inclusion list at the slot of. So when you sync a block until the current slot, you don't really get inclusion list for those blocks, and there's no way of getting it from P2P. We don't even have RPC request point basically for that, right? So when you call engine API's new payload, that you cannot have seen an inclusion list. And because of you don't know it, right? So I don't know what is the right API definition for that. This is like, I don't like basically API stuff typically. I mean, I love working on it, but I'm sure there are people are have like better expertise in terms of like basically what is the definition for that. So I made this opinionated choices, basically says that if you're syncing a payload and it's not for the current slot, for which I don't have an inclusion list, I'm going to pass in an empty inclusion list to the engine into this new API payload. So I assume the EL client here that is given an empty inclusion list will not check for inclusion list validation. Obviously, that's probably not right, but noting this is my kind of design decision. I feel like this is the cleanest for Prism at this moment. But yeah, and this is the first one. The second one is that as a node, I have this memory of like unsatisfied inclusion list block root. So basically, when I call new payload, and then a new payload by definition will return, if it returns this status, it says invalid inclusion list, I will remember the block root for that. And then the reason being that when I call get head for validator duty, if the head is the same as the previously cached block root that's unsatisfied inclusion list, I will essentially filter the block root and get a parent root. That's the only reason I am basically caching. It's basically a 32 byte cache that catches the inclusion list, that catches the block root that doesn't satisfy inclusion list. And again, this is Prism design decision, basically. I'm sure some people will implement it differently. And then I have a getter as well that essentially just filters out the inclusion list, basically. So to filters out what is the right block root to use for validator duty. So attesters will use that to attest for patient block root. Sync committee will use that to vote for head root, and proposal will use that to build on top of the parent root. And I added this to do basically, but this is not right. I think there's a to do which Michael correctly pointed out in the Discord that the spec should be more cleaner in that regard, that it should be using what we have for get proposer root. Just currently there is this helper getter which is used for reorculate block. We should be adding the stuff there basically. And then, so that was for block processing. And for block building, how do you essentially alert that your EL client that's already building a block, given Fortress update and payload attribute, how do you pass in the inclusion list to them? Currently, I just have a background routine essentially. So I have a background routine. I think it's triggered at the 10-second mark or 11-second mark. I gather the current slot inclusion list. I first check if there's a proposal for the next slot, and then I pass in the inclusion list essentially. Again, this is dependent on the engine API endpoint, what we do. Currently, the engine API PR that Jin Hong opened has this endpoint that I'm using. It's called engine update payload with inclusion list, which you pass in the payload ID and then you pass in the inclusion list, and then you get a new payload ID back, basically. And so this is all depends on the engine API. Again, I haven't worked on the engine API much before, so it depends on what engine API we're using here. I will have to change this design. You can think of another way is essentially to pass in the inclusion list in the Fortress updates payload attribute, and then use that method to update. So this all depends on engine API. Let's see. And then for syncing, I basically have the Gaussian validation pipeline. It's basically the same thing as what we know on the P2P spec. For the inclusion list transactions, it's a nested bytes. And for the SSZ's perspective, it's a list. So I just have them as a list as what we have the execution payload. And it's very, very big. But that doesn't matter. That's just for coming to consensus. And then I have this manual check that's saying it ensures the transactions does not exceed 8 kilobyte. And that's basically what's defined in the spec. And I think one of my to-do or someone else can help is that I want to review the ordering of all the checks for the gossip to ensure there's no potential DOS concern. Because I want to kind of group them into, you do the cheaper check first and then the more expensive check later. And then how do you catch the inclusion disk? Here, again, this is my design. Like, I'm sure there's a better way of doing this. I just have a key of mapping of slot to validate the index. And then the value is essentially the nested bytes of transactions, and then a special flag that just saying seen twice. Do we see this? Did someone try to send to inclusion disk? And then it's basically here are the getters, and if the add is adding the inclusion list gets called twice on the same slot valid index, the seen twice flag gets flagged to true, and then but then there's one design consideration is that worst case the memory usage for this is probably 4 megabytes per slot because you assume 8 kilobyte of inclusion disk per validator, and then you assume there's not much duplicates in the worst case scenario. So you probably want some sort of like nice pruning and stuff like that. So there are typical ways to prune it. And then last but not least, for the validator API stuff, so Prism has its own like gRPC API that's used for validated duty. So I mainly work on the gRPC API. I didn't work so much on the Beacon API. I know Nico's working on the Beacon API. So we'll probably should make his as the default, look at his. But again, I feel like it's pretty similar. The only thing is that when you get in the inclusion list, there is a design decision to make on what is the input, right? Currently, I just have the input slot, and then I check whether it's the current or previous slot, and then I return the inclusion list transactions and a sync community index. But there are multiple ways of doing it. You can also input the validator index as well and stuff like that, and then return that. And for validator changes, it's fairly simple as well. You use a validator, you assign to a duty, and then if if you're performing a duty, then you're performing a duty, you fetch the inclusion list, you send the inclusion list, and then you send it. But yeah, this is what I have, and then I'm happy to share the notes in the chat or after the call. And yeah, questions welcome. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I'm probably
Yeah,
mispronouncing
Terence.
it.
Yeah, it's Katya. I have a question about the cache. So, you store in the cache inclusion lists, and what about transactions from execution payload? So I think that for slot n+1, the attesters also store or check the transactions being included in the execution load, if I got it right or not.
Yeah. So to clarify, this is the inclusion disk cache for catching for the next slot proposer specifically. So I know I know you I know if you're on proposing for the next slot, right? So hold on one second, blah 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 blah. No, let me okay, no, sorry. This is the cache for the next slot proposed and also for the net slot attesters as well. So your question is basically how does the net slot attesters use that essentially to know whether to vote on the right head or not, right? So so for the execution payload transactions, you get that over the network essentially. So say at t -1, I get the inclusion list, I add those to the cache. And then at the next slot, which is N, I receive the payload, and then I process the payload, and I use that cache to process the payload for the new payload call. So at that point, you have the transactions already from the payload because you just receive over the network. So it's basically compute on demand.
Yeah, I got it. Thanks. So on the next slot, you don't write in the cache, right?
No, you don't write in the cache.
Okay.
Nice. Maybe more like a high level queue of like yes, there are like different design considerations and different efficient, like you can consider different implementations for finding like the most efficient ones, but like have you encountered like any blockers, or like what's the progress been like, and where are you at generally, like?
I haven't. I haven't gone to a blocker, but then again, as my disclaimer earlier is that there are some portion of the spec. I wouldn't say the spec itself, engine API and consensus spec, which are the two things I'm looking into. I would say are not like 100% complete as well. So so the idea of this implementation is that given the knowledge I know today, I go as fast as possible. I have a prototype, and then I can start testing it and then use that as a feedback loop to update the spec, right? So I think like we're getting start getting pretty good feedback these days on, for example, the beacon API definition that Nico's working on, and then Michael's suggestion on using get proposal head. And then I also have another documentation which I pointed out the other day is that how do we essentially get an inclusion list committee? Do we want to do we want to use something that's like shuffling based, or do we want to use something that's like get aggregator based, basically that you don't know who the inclusion list committee of the head. So I think I think design writing code is probably easier than figure out those minor details of the spec, which we probably want to spend more time on.
Okay, sounds good. And then, so I guess testing is also like something you are like looking into, and maybe that's a good transition with the Jihoon, because I know you have tried to work on this. If there are no like any more questions for Terence.
Maybe
have a
one question.
actually.
Sorry,
Okay,
go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
Okay, so one was related to the beacon APIs that NC was working on. So there might be the case that you have two validators in the same slot, which have to produce an inclusion list. How do you handle that right now? Because I see you also only pass the slot when you get the inclusion list. So you just get a single one, right?
So there will be two separate call as well. And I do not have some sort of cache basically so the second call I will essentially code the EL. So I will code the EL once and I will code the EL twice. So the question here is, what does the EL return me? Does the EL return me empty for the second call, or does the EL return me a different inclusion list or the same inclusion list? Then again, I think this is another interesting aspect of what the API definition is. So I can see like three different like correct answer here, right? Whether it's returning you nothing for the second, returning something different, or returning the same thing as well. But from my present perspective, I am treating them as two separate calls.
Yeah, because it could be similar to produce attestation data and then the validator just signs twice over the same inclusion list. But I think here it would not add any value, right? Because
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think from the philosophical point of view, they should be different data. Then again, I think this is something that client diversity might also be nice. If client one does something slightly different than client two, then it becomes harder to game. Francesco, you had a question?
Yeah, I had a question about the second section you have, node remembrance of unsatisfied inclusion list block root. Like in my mind, you should not need to remember anything about previous inclusion list or whether or not they're satisfied. So I was wondering, like, are you using this at all, or like in what way are you using it?
So this is just to remember one block root, and that's only used for current slot. So this is used for a testers that's voting for essentially for the attester that is voting. So I need some way to essentially to filter out the head root, basically knowing the current head root cannot be used for LMD goes vote, and then I have to use the parent root. So this is just for the current slot testing.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I was looking at the spec right now about this, and I wonder if it would be useful to actually clarify this in get a tester head, because in get a tester head, there's nothing that says that you're only doing this for the current slot.
Yeah.
Like I think in principle, if the like I don't know, there were a bunch of empty slots and the head is still like some older block that didn't have a satisfied IL at that time, then you would still be applying this kind of filtering, which I don't think we really want to do. So maybe yeah, I don't know, maybe it's worth like just adding in the spec this like only for the current slot to kind of do this extra thing and get a tester head. Or like only if the head root is from the current slot.
Yeah, I think so as well. I mean, I think it's even better to I think like also mention in the get proposal head, because Michael was right to point out that currently there's a two ways of like it's kind of weird that because of late slot reorg or late block reorg that there is another way of choosing head, but there for proposal duty or validator duty, and here's another way. So like it would be nice to combine them into one single function.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'll have to see how that exactly works, but I'm a bit skeptical about this just because get proposer head shouldn't really take into account the compliance information in my mind. It's just like, for example, you can imagine a case where the proposer happens to be on the side where they saw the IL too late, maybe, or sorry, they saw the IL early enough. They think the block is compliant, but like most other people haven't seen in most other people don't see that don't think that the block is compliant. And I really think that the proposer should just decide based on votes and not based on their own kind of local view of IL compliance. So I don't know how to like homogenize the two. If I mean, it feels to me like the IL compliance really should belong only to a testing behavior and not to any other kind of behavior.
Okay, that's something we probably can settle offline with Michael then.
Nice. Yeah, great. Any other questions for Terence, or should we move on to Jihoon?
I had more of a general question, I guess.
Yeah.
On if there's in the implementation or in general, if there's any ideas for deterministically seeing how the final block is being built, right? Because you have different pipelines, you have inclusion, you have transactions that are being force included, and then you have, as you also showed in the diagram earlier, you have transactions that are going through the regular MEV boost pipeline. And so when they all meet in the final block, is there some deterministic ordering mechanism that's being used? Or if part of the block space is reserved for fossil-based transactions versus those that aren't?
Right. Yeah. So no, in the current spec, this is all kind of yeah. You can go back to the IP, but basically the block producer, which is well either the builder or the proposer, is free to include fossil transactions wherever he wants in the block. So there is no enforcement in terms of ordering. And yeah, no ordering and no position specifically. So we let it free to the block producer to include transactions wherever they want, as long as they are included. That's like the only condition we enforce. Yeah.
And are there any pros and cons to being ambivalent about the ordering? Just because, you know, if there's certain atomic batches that need to be ordered in specific ways or have those guarantees?
Yeah, the whole idea is to try and avoid the emergence of an IL market. If imagine like the worst idea, I think at least, will be to say fossil transactions will need to be included at the top of block. And then all of a sudden, all the MEV transactions are gonna crowd out like potentially censored transactions just because they want to get the top of block spots. So since we don't want that, like actually like giving some unconditional block space and like specifying an exact spot at which IL transactions need to be included should be avoided.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Are there any other questions? Okay, nice. So maybe Jihoon, if you are here.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, you are. Great.
Yeah. Let me share my screen. Sorry, I need to change my settings, so I need to rejoin.
Okay, no worries. We can. Is Jacob here? Yeah. Do
Yep.
you want to give some updates as well?
Yeah, I can do that. Let
Yes.
me. It's going to be much more high level than Terrence's doc, but I have some notes here. Let me see if I can share. Um, okay, I'm assuming you guys can see this.
Oh.
Yeah, just some quick notes, and then I also have some links here to the diffs of my repos against the upstreams. So yeah, we got some support on Lighthouse from Eton of the Sigma Prime team, who I believe is on the call, and we also have some others who have expressed interest to help on Lighthouse as well. So my plan is to shift the majority of my focus to Reth on the EL side, and also help out yeah, getting things merged into my Lighthouse. Maybe ultimately we'll that fork into Sigma Prime's repo. And so, and the plan is Shareth on Kurtosis DevNet with Prism. I think Prism is further along as of now. So the initial plan would be to launch some percentage of the EL clients with a modified mempool that would filter transactions, basically not insert them into its own mempool based on something like the call data, which I think would be maybe the most straightforward, either that or a particular sender. And we can configure this transaction spammer that you can configure in Kurtosis to broadcast transactions that are quote answerable or defined however we define this mempool logic. One thing that came up or has come up before, but is whether to reuse the fork choice updated engine API or to go with engine API endpoint. I think we called it update block with version 1 to allow the consensus layer to signal to the execution layer that it should its view of the current global inclusion list, so that the execution layer can incorporate that into the payload that it's building. So in Ref, it's much easier to do this with the existing fork choice updated. However, that would require some changes on the calling pattern from the consensus layer, because as I understand it, the consensus layer is only calling fork choice updated once after it sees the block for that slot. And so it would not, in order to incorporate the inclusion lists that are coming later in the slot, you'd either have to call it again or the first and only call until you've pretty high confidence about seeing all the inclusion list. But yeah, and then we shared some links. Alloy is just kind of a collection of Rust crates that the Reth repo uses quite heavily. And then there's Reth and Lighthouse, and then we also have fork choice PR from Eton. So yeah, if you're interested in collaborate, please reach out. Try to be responsive and find some good issues to work on. Sorry. But yeah, if any questions, happy to take them. But yeah, this is a little more high level than Terrence's talk. Otherwise,
That's great.
Okay, cool.
Can you put it back on, maybe?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, nice. Right. So what's the plan exactly with kurtosis? Like when do you think, like what do you have like an idea of like where you guys are at in terms of progress on Red and trying to get that working with the Prism or on kurtosis?
Yeah, I think I'll go ahead and implement this update block with inclusion list because that's
Okay.
how Terrence has implemented it. And I think that should be doable within the next day or two. At least I can wire up um, some kind of dummy method just to make sure that Prism is actually calling this API at the proper time. We can start collecting feedback there, and that I could probably get done by the end of the day. But yeah, I
Okay,
think
nice.
once that's
Great.
done, then we can, yeah, start iterating much more quickly, at least yeah, with Prism.
Okay, awesome. Great. Okay. Does anyone else have questions? Okay. And then yeah, I mean again it ties nicely with, I think Jihoon has been working on kurtosis as well recently for Prism. So Jihoon, if you're ready.
Yes. Let me share my screen. Sorry for the this permission config issue. Yeah. So before I start this, let me share the links to the write-up and GitHub. Can I see this? Yeah, so you can see the detailed instruction for running kurtosis in this HackMD, and you can find all the necessary scripts in this repo. So yeah, so today I will be talking about how to configure and run a local DevNet using Prism and Get prototypes. I prepared the write-up and script. So in this presentation, I'd like to focus on delivering a high-level overview, but please feel free to interrupt me if it sounds too hand-wavy or if you have any question. Before we begin, just like many other core devs, I'd like to say a special thank you to Perry. There was some issue with kurtosis. So like, for instance, if you go to Dora repository, clone it and run it at the latest commit, you will see that it fails. The reason is there was a release changing minimal config preset following the spec, and some client teams haven't reflected yet. And it Panda team noticed it last Saturday, and I connected to Perry this Monday after struggling about that issue over the weekend. And anyway, he saved my tons of time. and shared many tips to play with kurtosis. So yeah, let's get started. So we want to build Docker images of the Prism and Get prototype and use them to run a local devnet with kurtosis. So let's go step by step. So how can we build Docker images of Prism and Get? And you can just copy and paste this command at the root of each repository. But this is already over 10 lines of code. So I prepared a script in the hope that it may make your life easier. You can find the script at the GitHub that I shared at the chat. So let's say if you are working on Prism, then you can put this script at the root of Prism repo and then execute it. And then you can see that it will give you Docker images like this. And here is our kurtosis config. And you can see that it refers to those Docker images that we just built locally. So this enables us to make changes locally and then test it against the local devnet. So I think it's cool. So how can we run kurtosis? You can clone this repo and then go to kurtosis directory and then just hit make run. But some might just interested in running a local devnet without building Docker images. So I also made Docker images based on the latest commits and published Docker Hub. So in case you want to just fetch and use them, you can just hit make run registry instead. So once kurtosis command is done, it should look like this. And if you go to localhost 65500, you can see Dora the Explorer. The number is just magic number. And let's say that now we want to see what each node is doing. Then we can print all the logs of JSON RPC communication, including engine API, beacon API, and execution API. But this might be too verbose to follow what one specific node is doing. So instead, we can specify a node that we want to track. And in order to do that, we need to know the identifier of the node. And in kurtosis, there are services. And each node is running in a service. So we can get the list of service names using this command, kurtosis enclave inspect FOCIL. FOCIL is the name of the enclave that I hard-coded in that repo config. And let's say that we want to track here, like snooper engine 1 prism get. And then we can specify that service name here, and we can see all the logs that it's printing. So this is a brief introduction of how to run kurtosis. And I'd like to share what we found so far. So if you just clone the repo and run it, then you can have a definite of Prism and Get prototypes, and it works well on DNAP, but it starts to miss all slots after Electra fork is on. And in the log, we found a suspicious log complaining that when a new engine API, new payload v5 is called, it complains that unmarshalling array of inclusion list v1 failed. So I'm not sure if this bug lies on Prism or Get, maybe Get, I guess. But nonetheless, we found a bug and we have a starting point. Since we are using mainnet config, we are able to modify seconds per slot, but we cannot change slots per epoch. So if you don't want to wait for one epoch to see what's going wrong, you can just simply set Electra fork epoch to 0, and it maybe save your time a little bit. And also, if you want to run a devnet using different clients, such as Red and Lighthouse, then you can just replace this participants field of kurtosis config. So let's say that if you want to use Get and Teku instead of Get and Prism, then you can just specify corresponding Docker images here. So yeah, this is all from my end. And here are the links to the write-up and GitHub again. And thank you for your listening.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. There is a question by Terence.
Yes, please.
Not so much of a question, just the comments that will probably. So there are a lot of engine API related changes happen over the last few weeks. So it depends on where the get your rebase is on, whether and then just right now for testing Electra or DefNet5, we're using specific custom branches. I think that's either on Sina or like clients' repo. So depends on that, you may see some issue. But yeah, we can sort that out offline. But I do have a question. It's probably rather like slightly difficult one that we probably won't get into for the last 12 minutes, but I just want to throw it out there that having the kurtosis is very great, right? Because it allows us to test the happy path. And we can transition from, say, the NAP to Electra to FOCIL hard fork. But there is still this problem that we need to figure out is that how do we test that FOCIL is indeed working, right? Because when you run kurtosis, there is no censorship. So even though if you run the additional service as the transaction spammer, all like basically you will see all the transactions including the block, but you're not kind of sure whether there is a mempool censorship, and then we're using the FOCIL committee to include the transactions. So I think I find it difficult that how do we essentially see that part like this, like I think either visually or through logs or something. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's a really good question. So in current implementation of Prism, we have submit inclusion list, and that is called by beacon client, a validated client, right?
So I haven't added that. So that's one thing I can do is to add that testing endpoint. I think that's one way, right? And then I think that kind of helps because now you can just submit transactions to that endpoint and to make sure those transactions are included, so you know it's working. Another way is to, I guess, like I don't know how to do in Get, but like just add some censorship, I guess, like don't include transactions from this address when you code get payload or something, and then yeah, and then see whether it works through inclusion this mechanism.
Yes, I think that would be simple. We can make another branch that imposing some censorship, and then we run two different types of get. So one is censoring and one is not censoring, and we can see which one is censoring by the service name, and we can see if all blocks produced by that node is not accepted, if it makes sense.
Yeah, I think we can. Yeah, that makes sense intuitively. Yeah, we can probably. I think something to chat about offline because we only have 10 minutes. But yeah, this is awesome. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Nice. Thanks a lot. Any other cues, or I think maybe we move on because NC, do you have like update or something to share as well?
Yeah, so for Lodestar, I think we are about halfway there in terms of the full implementation. We have finished the gossip topic, gossip validation, the rec resp, and also engine API definition. Yesterday I also posted like a first draft on the Beacon API spec, and also I think Nico did some implementation on the Beacon API on Lodestar. So the remaining bigger items will be the fork choice and also the IL cache, which I believe could be done within a week or maybe 2 weeks. And yeah, and and also we probably want to write like a design decision hack MD similar to what Terence did with Prism when we got there. But so far, we just been following the spec and just implement them.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Cool. Okay, so there is not much time remaining, but I guess I would love to hear from anyone that's been working on it and I haven't really necessarily been in touch with. Like, does anyone from other clients, I don't know, did anyone start work on this? Yeah, maybe.
Yep, an update from the tech team. Actually, we started also working on FOCIL. We had a separate branch. We started working on it since last week. So we did some progress. We still don't have a working version of it, but yeah, since things settled down a little bit with Electra, we have some bandwidth. So yeah, we're making some progress there.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, great to hear.
Yeah, I've started prototyping and implementation of this in the Nethermind client. I'd say it's still pretty early stages. Like I need to test if it works and everything. But actually, I'll just paste the PR in the chat in case anyone is interested.
Nice. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so that's great. It looks like we have quite a lot of clients that have started working on this. It's awesome to hear. Originally, so no, first, are there like any outstanding questions? Like, does anyone have other questions related to implementation? Yeah, Katya.
Yeah, I have a question about the number of inclusion lists propagated. So in the abstract, I see that one validator can gossip one EL, and in the equivocation, I can see that it's no more than 2 ELs. So is it a discrepancy or how it works?
Oh no, it's like if the validator just like follows the honest spec, then he should propose just one IL. But like in case of equivocation, we want to propagate the 2 lists a single validator has generated, just so everyone is aware of that IL committee member having equivocated, and we can actually monitor it and ignore that IL committee member. But yeah, you should always just propagate one IL if you're following the spec and honestly.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. And I would like to share that I've started working on metrics for FOCIL, so it probably would be also helpful for monitoring. I'm going to raise an issue in Bacon metrics and discuss it there. So probably it will be interesting for researchers as well. What would you like to measure or monitor? And yeah, the kurtosis part was helpful. Jihon, thanks. That's it.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Yeah, we can definitely also take this offline. We have definitely ideas about like what things we would like to monitor for FOCIL, and I think since like DevNets are like happening relatively soon, we can use that data to start this. Right. So yeah, I think that was I guess the last point, which was coordinating. I think the last meeting, which was quite a while ago, we said we are aiming for DevNets end of January. It does seem like a few of you guys are like right on track. Do we need anything else in terms of coordination? Like yeah, do you guys have all you need to make progress and catch up? Are there like any questions about coordination per se here? Okay, that's great. I'll take this as a no, everything is good and we are making progress, which is awesome. Yeah, if no one else has other questions, thanks a lot for attending. looking forward to see you guys regularly now, and feel free to reach out to us. I think Matthew said he was gonna also post notes with like all the links and the progress that has been made until now. So yeah, thanks again, and see you guys soon.
Bye.